Well, let me do a quick time check and see if we have time for questions from the crowd. I want to open it up. I really appreciate the perspectives here, and I think that it's important to hear from all of you. And so, yes, please. And please introduce yourself.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Maureen McGuigan. I'm the director of Arts and Culture Department in Lackawanna County. I hate milking this, but it's where The Office is filmed, Scranton. Just usually gives people perspective. So we're about a small city of about 70,000. I'm actually part of local government. But thank you for creating a safe space where we can have these complex and difficult conversations. I don't think we get to do that enough. And there's two thoughts. So I guess my question is, how do we create spaces but then encourage people of all colors, income levels to cross spaces, or create a space where everybody can feel comfortable? I don't know if any of you heard on NPR a couple weeks ago. I was really saddened by it that most people are friends with their own race. And that made me sad, but I also think that also produces a lot of opportunity. And I think spaces and getting people to come together. Also, as a grantor, people are always coming to me about equity and diversity, but they don't know how to do it, which I'm like, well, it's not that hard, but you have to take people where they are. So I guess my question is, have you seen that, or how do we encourage people to take risks and go to a different neighborhood or a different business, or create a space where everybody is encouraged? I hope that made sense.
So I think the word that comes to mind, and I don't know if I said it in my rant, solidarity. As a South Asian, I have been doing a lot of work. So many people read the New York Times, and the 1619 Project was a piece of the 400 years of the larger piece of this larger project called the 400 Years of Inequality, which was a national call for folks to think about their own role and positionality, and the fact that last year was the 400-year anniversary of the first slave ship landing here in Jamestown. My response to that call was thinking about South Asians and Black people and our solidarity work with each other and the solidarity work that can be happening. What I mentioned before in terms of my work in Brownsville, there was only one. When I was working there every day, I still work there in a different capacity as a funder now. When I was working there every day and reporting to Brownsville 7 days a week, there was one Bangladeshi family, right? So there was one family that looked like me. And I knew them and they knew me. We spoke in Bengali. I used to run a farmer's market. I would save certain vegetables for them. We had our deal going. I also found ways to connect with other people. And other people found ways to connect with me. But what it required was this idea, this thought, and this belief that we are in this together, that my liberation is bound with theirs, and vice versa. And I think that, a lot of what we're seeing in this country now, from the national conversation down to the neighborhood level, is that, do you see yourself in the other person? Do you see them as the other, or do you see them as a part of yourself? And so I think, the call to have folks going to another neighborhood or frequenting another business is that, do you see that as your task, as your business, as your neighborhood as well, in some ways, that we are in the city together? Because if you don't, then it is a little bit of a performative piece, right? But if you do, then there's an opportunity for a much deeper relationship that gets to play out. I don't know if other folks. Yeah.
I'll just add a little piece of that. I think it just points to the work that needs to be done maybe before you talk about the bike lane or the park. And that's just an opportunity for partnership. So there's groups that lead conversations about humanizing folks, getting to know folks, and are they a part of your work? Have you done your own personal work as an individual so that even your perspective as you approach the project is at a certain place?
I would just have another point, which is that it's also important, though, to acknowledge that sometimes people need space and time to heal, to deal with internal and very difficult issues. And so while, of course, it's important to connect and interact and do this very hard work of having exchange and connectedness, the reality is in the U.S. and so many places, there are very challenging, very difficult, painful things that sometimes people are dealing with and working through. And it's very important to also respect and acknowledge that, so that internal work and family work also needs space and resources. And that's where kind of, I think Nooper mentioned it, right, the stand back or the allyship or provide resources sometimes does need kind of a respectful distance as well.
And I'll just add this because I think you said you worked for the city. If you're a planner or works for a city, and Justin can speak to this, having a position of power to let people know that that's their actual job, to go out to these communities. You're a public servant. We can't do armchair planning. You can't make decisions for communities sitting downtown. That's your actual role. So I think that's important to remind folks as well.
I'm actually going to build on this. So I'm Elizabeth Cohen. I'm from Hunter College. This is my home here. And I was mentioning at lunch that once a month in this very room, we have public conversations through Conversations New York organization that brings people from all over the city together, in addition to using our privately owned public spaces here in New York, and once a year in Bryant Park, where we had almost 500 people in public conversation. So we haven't talked a lot about third spaces and spaces where people can come, agreeing that we need sometimes to work on ourselves and by ourselves, but also where people can come for public conversation. So Hunter is very committed to that and has allowed us to use this space to promote public conversation, so people with different ideas can come together and get to know each other. So I think it's a great next step for all of us to think about more of those.
Yeah, and I would just say, too, I think it's important to have a learning mindset, especially, being a white person, and conversations about race can be scary, to say the wrong thing or to feel. So to be open to have those learning moments and to hear how to use privilege and be able to be a force for advancing equity and learning along the way, I think it's important for that journey.
Hi, Han Yu from the California Endowment. At our foundation, we're having very difficult conversations around anti-Black racism and exploitative capitalism. And I haven't heard the latter come up very much, and I think it is really important within the context of inclusive community development, where real estate developers will come out on the winning side every single time. And so just lots of examples over in our exploitation workforce in the name of economics and so on. So can you speak more to that in terms of economic forces and inclusive community development and how that's being incorporated into the conversations?
Here in New York, there have obviously been tons of conversations about this. The current administration has been working to find new tools and new ways that the economic dimensions and the kind of the longevity of change is something that is sustainable. So New York's been experimenting with more land lease development deals, for example. So in the South Bronx, there's a project called Spofford, now named the Peninsula, which normally would have been a development that goes to RFP and is sold for $1 to a developer, et cetera, et cetera. Instead of that normal model, the city changed and did land lease, which means the city maintained ownership of the land. With that came a significant amount of greater control over what happens on that land, right? The long-term permanent affordability of the development, the much more robust community-led input on what the programming of those spaces was going to be. So that was a kind of a legal and policy tool that was put in place. That's unique in that it was connected to city ownership of land, and frankly, that's not the majority of the way development still happens. It was kind of like a pilot, but having kind of proof of concept for other models for how we develop that are just fundamentally different from business as usual is what we need more of. There's also work happening with Community Land Trust and kind of piloting that. There's work going on with looking at the MWBE and the whole procurement side of that billions of dollars of budget that I mentioned. So there are different things being tested. They aren't yet, to be perfectly honest, like at scale that they're that transformative, but we do have tangible projects where things are being done differently from the normal developer-led model. It's still America, and capital is capital. We're in the capital of capital. And so it is a powerful force, but the more that we have good examples, the better, and then you can kind of amplify that work.
I would say within the realm of transportation, there is interesting conversations happening around answering whether transportation is a public good. Should we be charging fares for people who need to use buses? Within the context of New York City specifically, whether we should be charging fares. In New York City, we are heavily relying on our transit system. This is a city that does have immense pockets of poverty. Should people have to walk 3 hours to work because they cannot afford the $2.75? There are programs that we're beginning to develop that address this issue of affordability and lack thereof, that will literally cut you off to economic opportunities, schools within the city. It hasn't gone far enough, to be honest. And I think we're surely lacking within the field of transportation that social impact. What does it mean for people to be able to get places? Does it matter if our fare box recovery, which is the amount of money that people pay to get on a bus or subway, totally subsidizes our systems? Maybe we should just think of it as like public school. A lot of conversations surrounding that.
Yeah, I just wanted to give another example. A project that I was a part of post-Hurricane Sandy in the Northeast region here was a project called Rebuild by Design. And I cite that because that was a moment in which post-Hurricane Sandy, we knew federally that there was going to be community development block grant, disaster recovery funding that was going to come to the region. But the way in which it was dispersed was completely different. And the way it was dispersed was, they created an entire design competition that was funded by private philanthropy. So I think it was JPB, Dodge, Rockefeller. I think there were a couple of other funders that said, we'll put in the money for the process of the design competition because we know that the federal funding is going to come down the pike anyways. And what it allowed was that they were able to set the rules of the competition. And one of the rules was that any design team that proposed a project to protect against the next superstorm had to be co-created with the community that it was intended to serve. So we have seen many examples in which community engagement, the box is checked. Because that was a requirement and because it was stated explicitly that they would be scored on the level of co-creation, the final presentations of the competitions, those design teams had the entire community bust in with them to give the presentation. I say that because that was the carrot, right? And they thought that and believed that because that was a part of the rule, that they had to make that happen tenfold, right? And that was one of the teams that ended up doing that because of the fact that it was a rule that was set. And so even if it's not a larger city policy, I think it's an example, especially in philanthropy, that you can actually change the rules to serve the intended outcome that you're aiming for.
Thanks, Newport. And I just want to thank all of our panelists. Today, I think we're out of time. Is that right? Okay, so thank you all for this great discussion. Thank you.